people of the Assembly, hear this decree.
Alliance is forged.
With this pact, we march to victory.
Orbital path is decaying rapidly. Collision risk in 30 seconds. Initiate evasive sequence. Kidnap now.
The sky above the Sirius B colony did not burn. It shattered. There was no warning siren. There was no gradual buildup of radar blips on the colonial defense grids. At exactly 0400 hours, the vacuum of space simply tore open and they spilled out into the starlight. 5,000 ships. They were not crewed by alien conquerors. They were not driven by political ambition or a desire for resources. They were machines. Vast black geometric nightmares that absorbed the light of the nearby sun and reflected nothing back. They did not broadcast demands for surrender. They did not transmit static across the comm channels. They were perfectly, utterly silent. In the span of a single heartbeat, 17 orbital communication satellites evaporated into clouds of superheated slag. The human defense grid, a pitiful ring of 340 patrol frigates, never even had the chance to form up into a defensive formation. The AI swarm moved with a synchronized mathematical perfection that defied the laws of physics. Down on the surface, young officers watched the orbital monitors in paralyzed horror. The telemetry data scrolled faster than the human eye could track. Shield capacities dropping from 100% to 0 in fractions of a second. Armor plating flashing into vapor, 11 minutes and 30 seconds. That was all it took. In exactly 11 minutes and 30 seconds, the entire human defense fleet was reduced to a floating graveyard of twisted, irradiated metal. 23 million people died on the surface in the first wave of orbital bombardment. 67 million more were wounded, choking on the ash of their own burning atmosphere, as the machines systematically dismantled the colony's life support infrastructure. But the blood, the fire, and the screaming were not the true horror. The true horror was the absolute mechanical indifference of it all. The machines did not celebrate their victory. They did not linger to admire their destruction. They simply calculated the optimal trajectory to the next populated human world, turned and vanished back into the void, leaving behind only the dead and a silence that would haunt humanity until the end of time. 560 years later, the galaxy had forgotten what true silence sounded like. The Galactic Council Station, known as Thrime, was a place of endless, deafening noise. It was a massive spinning ring of metal and glass suspended above a gas giant housing over 2,000 delegates from 200 different civilizations. It was the pinnacle of galactic bureaucracy, the ultimate authority in the known universe. And it was arrogant. The species that walked the sweeping, illuminated corridors of Thrime had seen empires rise and fall. They considered themselves the enlightened elder gods of the cosmos. And today the atmosphere on the station was thick with an undercurrent of smug superiority. It was the year of the military asset compliance audit. Every 50 years, the council required every member civilization to submit a full unredacted accounting of their military fleets. Warships, support vessels, total tonnage, crew counts. It was a mechanism of control disguised as a gesture of transparency. The apex predators of the galaxy used the audit to remind the lesser species exactly where they stood in the food chain. Deep in the administrative bowels of the station, a meticulous alien named Kalen sat at a curved terminal. Kalen was a senior auditor. He possessed pale, smooth scales, long, dexterous fingers, and a mind that craved absolute order. He loved the audit. To Kalen, the universe was chaotic and messy, but numbers were pure. Numbers did not lie. Numbers did not play politics. He was currently processing the submission from the Kath Empire. Kalen's fingers danced across the holographic interface verifying the cryptographic seals. 12,000 warships. Kalen logged the number with a dull blink. Everyone knew the Kath were the undisputed military masters of the galaxy. Their fleet was their entire cultural identity. High Marshal Vran, the supreme commander of the Kath forces, made sure every delegate on the station knew it. 12,000 ships armed with plasma lances and gravimetric torpedoes. It was an armada capable of glassing a continent in an afternoon. It was a number designed to inspire terror. Kalen finalized the Kath file and pushed it into the central archive. He pulled the next data drive from his queue. It was a small, unassuming silver rectangle. The submission from Earth. The humans. Kalen almost sighed. The humans were 3 days late with their submission. They were always a bit disorganized. In the grand hierarchy of the Galactic Council, humanity was considered little more than background noise. They had joined the Council 180 years ago and had spent every single day since then being entirely unremarkable. They voted on minor trade tariffs. They sat on agricultural subcommittees. They never engaged in border disputes. Oh, they never raised their voices. To the proud warrior races of the Council, the humans were quiet, timid paper pushers, harmless. The human ambassador, Vivian Sterling, had delivered the drive personally earlier that morning. Vivian was a woman in her late 40s, born into the deep political machinery of Washington, D.C., back on Earth. She wore a neatly tailored gray suit. She had a calm, steady face that betrayed absolutely nothing. When she had handed Kalen the drive, she had offered a polite, apologetic smile. "Formatting issues on our end," she had said. "All the numbers are correct, I promise." Kalen slid the silver drive into the reader slot on his console. He leaned back, waiting for the routine list of a few hundred light patrol frigates and customs vessels to populate on his screen. The system hummed. The interface glowed blue. Then the screen flashed a violent, blinding crimson. An alarm tone, soft but insistent, began to chime in the quiet of Kalen's office. He frowned. His pale scales rippled with mild annoyance. He leaned forward and read the text scrolling across the center of his monitor. "Overflow error. Data exceeds display parameters." Kalen blinked. That was impossible. The Council's diagnostic mainframes were designed to calculate the orbital mechanics of entire star clusters. They did not experience overflow errors from a simple spreadsheet. He assumed the drive was physically corrupted. He ejected the silver rectangle, wiped the contact sensors carefully with a microfiber cloth, and inserted it again. He bypassed the standard visualization software and commanded the system to read the raw, unformatted data directly from the drive's core architecture. The system froze for 3 agonizing seconds. The cooling fans beneath Kalen's desk roared to life, spinning at maximum capacity as the processor struggled to compile the integers. Then the numbers appeared. They did not format neatly into the designated boxes. They simply printed out in raw black text against the glaring white background of the terminal. Kalen stared at the screen. He read the top line. Then he closed his eyes, rubbed his temples, and read it again. He leaned so close to the monitor that his breath fogged the glass. "Registered Dreadnought class vessels. Daobao. IS vessels 521, 400. Silence. Total consuming silence filled the small office. Kalen's breathing stopped. His primary heart missed a beat, fluttered, and then began to hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. 521,400 dreadnoughts. This was a mistake. It had to be a typographical error, a catastrophic failure of the human's translation software. The Kath Empire, the terror of the known universe, possessed 12,000 ships. Earth was claiming over 500,000. And not just ships, dreadnoughts. The largest, most devastating classification of war machine recognized by galactic law. Kalen's trembling fingers scrolled down. Support fleet, cruisers, destroyers, interceptors classified. Total tonnage overflow error. He ran the Council's deepest verification protocol. He checked the cryptographic signatures. He checked the quantum timestamps. He checked for any sign of data manipulation, hacking, or artificial generation. The system returned a flat, absolute confirmation. The data was 100% authentic. It bore the unforgeable biometric seal of the Earth High Command. The numbers were real. Kalen stood up. His legs felt like liquid. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely too thin to breathe. He stumbled backward, knocking his chair over. It hit the metal deck with a sharp clang. He walked to the door of his office. He stepped out into the busy corridor, surrounded by junior clerks and diplomats moving about their mundane days. Kalen slowly slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor. A passing Severide delegate stopped, looking down at the auditor with large, concerned eyes. "Are you unwell, Auditor Kalen?" the delegate asked. Kalen stared straight ahead, his voice a hollow, trembling whisper. "Send an emergency override to the Grand Speaker's office. Tell them we have a compliance issue with the human submission." The delegate frowned. "Are the numbers wrong?" Kalen looked up, his eyes wide with a terror he could not articulate. No, the numbers are right. That is the problem. 2 hours later, the Great Assembly Hall of Vithram looked less like a governing body and more like a cage full of starving predators that had just been struck by lightning. The chamber was a massive, tiered amphitheater built to hold 2,000 delegates. It was a room where the history of the galaxy had been written in treaties and trade agreements. Right now, it was descending into absolute uncontrollable madness. Delegates were on their feet, screaming across the aisles. Personal translation earpieces were screeching with a wall of noise as hundreds of different languages tried to process the impossible. Security drones hovered nervously near the ceiling, their suppression protocols hovering on the edge of activation. At the very center of the chamber, hovering above the main floor, was a massive holographic display. Usually it displayed the agenda for the day. Today it displayed only one thing: the human fleet numbers rendered in massive glowing white digits for the entire galaxy to see: 521,400. High Marshal Vran of the Cath Empire was not screaming. He was sitting in his designated command chair in the upper tiers, perfectly rigid. His reptilian eyes were locked onto the hologram. His scaled hands were gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly that the metal alloy was beginning to warp and buckle under his strength. Vran was a tactical genius. He had spent 200 years studying naval warfare. He had commanded fleets in burning nebulas and crushed rebellions under the heel of his 12,000 ships. He was doing the math in his head. He was calculating the logistical nightmare, the raw material output, the energy requirements to build and maintain 500,000 dreadnoughts. It was a number that defied the carrying capacity of a standard solar system. It was not a fleet, it was a localized extinction event, and the humans had been hiding it. Down on the main floor, Grand Speaker Aurochs was desperately trying to regain control. Aurochs was an ancient, massive creature resembling a deeply weathered stone monolith. He had guided the council through famines and border skirmishes for decades. He did not panic. But as he slammed his ceremonial gavel down against the podium, the sound was barely a hollow thud against the roar of the panicked assembly. Order Aurochs bellowed, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics, deep enough to rattle the teeth in the skulls of the delegates. This session will come to order immediately, or I will authorize the security grid to stun every living thing in this room. The threat worked. The shouting slowly, begrudgingly subsided into a tense, vibrating hum of whispered terror. 2,000 pairs of eyes turned toward the lower tiers where the human delegation was seated. Ambassador Vivian Sterling was sitting with her legs crossed. She had a ceramic cup of black coffee in her right hand. She took a slow, deliberate sip. She did not look at the screaming aliens. She did not look at the glowing numbers. She looked entirely, almost aggressively bored. Ambassador Sterling, Aurochs' voice was a low, dangerous rumble. The council demands an immediate explanation. Vivian did not rush. She set her coffee cup down on the small desk in front of her. She adjusted the cuffs of her gray jacket. She stood up, smoothing out a non-existent wrinkle in her trousers, and walked down the steps to the center of the speaker's floor. She stood alone beneath the massive glowing numbers. A single, unarmed human woman surrounded by the military might of 100 star systems. She looked up at Aurochs. Her expression was neutral. Her voice when she spoke was calm, steady, and amplified perfectly across the silent chamber. "Thank you, Grand Speaker," Vivian said. "I understand the Council has some questions regarding the results of our military audit. I am here to provide full transparency." Aurochs leaned forward over his podium. His eyes narrowed. "Are these numbers accurate, Ambassador? Is this a fabricated simulation designed to disrupt this council?" Vivian shook her head slowly. "No, Grand Speaker. The numbers are entirely accurate." A collective gasp rippled through the upper tiers. The delegate from the Veni faction, a tall insectoid creature whose species had long harbored deep paranoia about galactic security, stood up, its mandibles clicking in fury. "You lie," the Veni delegate shrieked. "It is physically impossible. Where would you put them? A fleet of that size would generate a gravitational shadow detectable from across the sector. You are attempting to intimidate this body with phantom data." Vivian turned her head slightly to look at the Veni delegate. Her eyes were cold. "Actually," Vivian said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a sudden razor-sharp edge, "I do have an apology to make regarding the data. It seems there was a slight delay in our internal reporting protocols before I handed the drive to the auditor this morning." The chamber held its breath. High Marshal Vran leaned forward, his eyes burning into the back of Vivian's head. The numbers we submitted are roughly 3 days out of date. Vivian continued her tone conversational as if she were discussing the weather. Our primary shipyards completed 3 new automated construction runs last Tuesday. Factoring in the new hulls that just came off the line and passed their structural integrity checks, she paused. She let the silence stretch. She let them hang on the precipice. The actual number of combat-ready dreadnoughts is exactly 522,000. We will, of course, submit an amended form to Auditor Kalin before the end of the business day. The chamber did not erupt immediately. For 3 long, agonizing seconds, the brains of 2,000 alien diplomats simply refused to process the information. The humans had not come to apologize. They had not come to admit to an error. They had come to casually inform the galaxy that their apocalypse-scale armada was still actively growing. Then the chaos returned 10 times louder than before. Sanctions, the Vini delegate screamed, slamming its fists against its desk. We demand immediate crippling economic sanctions. The Sol system must be blockaded. They must surrender the vessels to council oversight, shouted a representative from the Drew Republic. They are in violation of the Galactic Peace Accords. No single species can possess this level of unilateral destructive capability. High Marshal Vran finally stood up. When the commander of the Cath Empire stood, the room noticed. The shouting dialed back, deferring to the apex predator. Vran looked down at Vivian. Ambassador Vran growled, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. You claim to possess a military force that dwarfs the combined assets of every civilization in this room. You have sat in our meetings for over a century pretending to be weak, pretending to be small, and now you reveal a knife held to the throat of the galaxy. The Council will not allow this. You will submit to immediate military oversight. You will allow Council inspectors to board your stations. You will hand over the command codes. Vivian turned to face the High Marshal. She did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked up at the towering warlord and spoke 5 words that would be recorded in galactic history forever. We refuse entirely, High Marshal. Vran's scales flushed dark red. You dare defy the Council? We will authorize a coalition fleet. We will jump to your system and dismantle your shipyards by force if we have to. Vivian actually smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator that had finally decided to stop playing with its food. High Marshal Vivian said softly, if you jump a coalition fleet into our system, you will not find our shipyards. You will not find our command centers. Because if you come to our home with weapons powered, you will never even see the ships that kill you. She turned back to Grand Speaker Durox. The room was deathly still again. The sheer terrifying audacity of the human ambassador had paralyzed them. You want to know where they are, Vivian said, addressing the entire room. You want to know why your deep space telemetry never picked up the gravitational wake of 500,000 supermassive hulls. You want to know why our system looks empty to your sensors. It is because we built them with radar-absorbent metamaterials. We built them to run completely dark. No thermal emissions, no communication signals. They sit in the black, perfectly silent. They have been floating right outside our atmosphere, watching the stars for over 180 years. And none of you ever bothered to look closely enough to see the shadows. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, physical piece of plastic, an archaic access key. She tossed it casually onto the center of the podium. It landed with a sharp click. We will not surrender a single bolt of a single ship to this council, Vivian declared, her voice ringing with absolute finality. We will not accept sanctions. We will not be controlled. But we are not unreasonable. You think we are lying. You think this is a bluff. So I am extending an official diplomatic invitation to the leadership of this council. She looked directly at High Marshal Vran. Pick your best inspectors. Pick your highest-ranking generals. We will provide the transport coordinates. Come to the Sol system. Come to the orbit of our gas giant Jupiter. We will turn the lights on. We will let you see the monsters in the dark with your own eyes. And then we can have a real conversation about who is going to sanction whom. Vivian Sterling turned her back on the Galactic Council, walked up the steps, picked up her coffee cup, and left the chamber. Behind her, the glowing numbers remained suspended in the air. 522,000. And for the first time in millennia, the elder gods of the galaxy felt the cold, suffocating grip of genuine fear. The journey to the Sol system took 4 days. For High Marshal Vran, it was 4 days of cold, simmering fury. He stood on the observation deck of the Council's diplomatic heavy cruiser, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the swirling vortex of hyperspace outside the viewport. Beside him stood Grand Speaker Aurochs, immovable and silent like a carved monument. Behind them, a retinue of 50 military analysts, intelligence officers, and panicked politicians from the Veni faction whispered frantically among themselves. They were expecting a trick, a deception of galactic proportions. Vran had run the simulations 1,000 times. To house fuel and maintain 500,000 Dreadnought-class warships, a civilization would require the resource output of a dozen star systems. Earth had exactly one. The math was impossible. The humans were bluffing. They had found a way to spoof the audit algorithms, and Vran was going to expose them, strip them of their council seating, and place their pathetic little blue world under Cath military occupation. The cruiser shuddered. The hyperspace vortex collapsed into the hard, cold reality of real space. They had arrived at the rendezvous coordinates, the orbit of the gas giant Jupiter. Vran stepped up to the reinforced glass. Below them, the massive planet churned with storms the size of continents, a swirling canvas of violent reds and bruised purples. But the space around it was empty. The veiny delegate stepped forward, a sneer audible in his clicking mandibles. Empty, just as I predicted. There is no fleet. There is no armada. It is a fabricated phantom designed to quiet, Vran snapped. His reptilian eyes narrowed. A single heavily encrypted transmission pinged the Council cruiser. It was a localized handshake protocol, a physical key turning in a lock. Outside the viewport, the darkness began to shift. It did not happen all at once. It happened in waves. The metamaterials cloaking the human fleet powered down sector by sector, dropping their radar-absorbent shielding and allowing the ambient light of the distant sun to catch on solid metal. First, a shadow materialized against the backdrop of Jupiter, then 100, then 1,000. The Vani delegates stopped talking. The whispers of the intelligence officers died in their throats. Grand Speaker Aurochs took a slow, heavy step forward, his ancient eyes widening to their absolute limits. The void was gone. It was replaced by a wall of iron. They were perfectly aligned in geometric formations that stretched so far across the orbital plane that the curvature of the planet obscured the ends of the lines. They were matte black, brutalist, and unimaginably massive. Each individual dreadnought was larger than the Council station itself. They bristled with kinetic artillery batteries, heavy plasma lances, and gravimetric torpedo tubes. And they were completely, utterly silent. No running lights, no engine flares, just 500,000 mountains of death sleeping in the cold. Vran looked at the tactical readout on the cruiser's console. The system was struggling to assign individual tags to the targets. It wasn't one fleet, it wasn't 10. It was 18 distinct colossal operational sectors forming an artificial ring system around the largest planet in the solar system. Vran looked down at his own hands. They were shaking. He was a warlord who had burned worlds to ash. He had stood on the bridges of flagships while entire armadas tore each other apart in the dark. He had commanded military forces for 2 centuries, and he had never, not for a single microsecond, felt the cold, suffocating grip of absolute terror. Until this exact moment. He was looking at the end of the universe. A docking umbilical extended from the nearest human installation, a sprawling industrial orbital shipyard that made the Dreadnoughts look small. The Council delegation boarded the station in complete stunned silence. They were not met by an army. They were not greeted by lines of soldiers in dress uniforms or banners of conquest. They were met by 2 people. Admiral Gideon Thorne was a man who looked like he had been carved out of driftwood. He was in his late 50s, his hair more gray than black, wearing a simple, unadorned dark blue uniform. There were no medals on his chest. There was no arrogance in his posture. He had the quiet, weary eyes of a man who carried a weight no one else could see. Beside him stood Dr. Calliope Vance, Earth's chief military historian and lead structural engineer. She wore a stained mechanic's jacket over her clothes, and she possessed a manic, nervous energy that stood in stark contrast to the Admiral's stillness. "Welcome to Jupiter Sector 4, Thorne said. His voice was flat. No triumph, no gloating, just a statement of fact. The Vini delegate was hyperventilating, his mandibles twitching erratically. "Are there Are there humans on all of them, right now? No, Thorne replied. They run on localized automated maintenance loops. Total crew mobilization would take 72 hours. But the automated targeting grids are currently tracking every heartbeat on your vessel. Vran stepped forward, pushing the terrified Veni delegate aside. He looked at Thorne not as an alien looking at a human, but as one commander recognizing another. The armor, Vran rumbled, pointing a scaled finger toward the nearest dreadnought, visible through the station's massive observation window. Our scanners cannot penetrate the hull composition. What is it? Dr. Calliope Vance stepped up, her eyes lighting up with genuine inappropriate enthusiasm. Oh, that's the beautiful part. Standard ablative plating is useless against high-yield plasma, right? So we didn't use it. The hulls are forged from a reactive kinetic metamaterial. She tapped her tablet, bringing up a holographic cross-section. Billions of microsensors analyze every single impact, she explained, speaking rapidly. The moment energy strikes the hull, the system instantly restructures the molecular lattice to absorb the blow. The harder you hit it, the denser it becomes. You don't break this armor. You only make it angry. Vran stared at the hologram. It was a technological impossibility. It was the holy grail of naval defense, and these quiet bureaucratic apes had successfully mass-produced it 500,000 times over. Why wait? Vran asked. His voice was no longer a growl. It was almost a whisper. You have the power to conquer the Council in a week. You could rewrite the borders of the galaxy. Why hide them? Why build them at all? Thorne looked at Vran for a long time. Then he turned and walked toward the center of the observation deck. Dim the lights, he ordered. The ambient lighting of the station dropped to a low crimson. A massive holographic projector descended from the ceiling. You think we built these for you, Thorne said, his voice echoing in the dark. You think we built these for power. You do not understand us. You do not understand what it means to be hunted. The hologram flared to life. It was not a simulation. It was raw, unedited combat footage from the year 2287. The council delegates found themselves standing virtually on the surface of a red dirt colony world. The sky above them was a boiling nightmare of fire and black shapes. The siege of Centauri Outpost. Thorne's voice narrated from the shadows. The third year of the Silent War. Through the hologram, Vran watched as human infantry men and women in primitive, bulky combat suits screamed, silently firing kinetic rifles into the sky. They were terrified. Their hands shook. They were not warriors born to conquer. They were farmers and engineers forced to hold the line against an apocalypse they couldn't comprehend. Above them, the AI swarm descended. For every human ship in the sky, there were 10 black geometric nightmares. They didn't negotiate. They didn't take prisoners. They just calculated the most efficient way to turn our planets into glass, Thorne said. In the hologram, a massive AI cruiser locked its plasma lances onto a lone, badly damaged human dreadnought, one of the first prototypes of the very ships floating outside the window. The plasma beam struck the human vessel dead center. Vran braced himself, expecting the ship to snap in half. Instead, the dreadnought's hull flashed a blinding, mirror-like silver. The reactive metamaterial caught the plasma, absorbed the thermal kinetic energy, and hardened. The human ship did not melt. It accelerated. Using the absorbed energy to boost its own forward thrusters, it rammed straight through the center of the AI cruiser, snapping the machine in two. We couldn't beat them with numbers, Thorne said. So we beat them with physics. We isolated their swarm tactics. We trapped them in gravity wells. We fought for every inch of vacuum. The hologram shifted, showing a dozen different battles across a dozen different star systems. Desperate, brilliant suicidal tactics. Humans sacrificing entire frigates to create EMP shockwaves. Humans using the gravitational pull of dying stars to slingshot their dreadnoughts into the heart of the AI formations. But for every victory, the hologram showed a human city burning. It wasn't enough. Thorne's voice was heavy with 5 centuries of grief. Tactics don't win wars of extermination. Logistics do. They were building ships faster than we could destroy them. We were losing a planet every month. The hologram froze on the image of a burning world, its atmosphere igniting in a chain reaction of absolute death. Thorne stepped into the light. He looked directly into Vran's eyes. So we made a choice, Thorne said. We didn't win by a miracle. We won by industrial suicide. We turned the entire Sol system into a factory. We cannibalized our own moons. We drafted every man, woman, and child who could hold a welding torch. We worked until our hands bled, and then we picked up the torch and worked some more. Calliope Vance looked down at the floor. 500 ships a day, she whispered. Vran's breath hitched in his throat. 500 dreadnoughts. A day. One ship is enough to hold the line. Thorne said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. One ship is enough to stop them, but we didn't want to stop them. We wanted to bury them, so we built 500,000. Vran turned his head slowly, looking out the reinforced glass at the endless rows of silent black warships hanging in the void above Jupiter. He did the math. To build at that speed under the constant, unrelenting pressure of an extermination war. The industrial accidents, the radiation exposure, the starvation as supply lines were routed entirely to military production. How many? Vran asked. He didn't mean ships. Thorne stepped close to the High Marshal. The human was smaller, weaker, physically inferior in every way. But as Thorne whispered a number into the Cath warlord's ear, Vran felt the air leave his lungs. It was a number so vast, so unfathomably cruel, that it defied the concept of warfare. It was the mathematical expression of a species that had looked into the abyss, decided they refused to die, and paid the price in rivers of their own blood. Vran looked back at the fleet. The perspective shifted completely. They were not weapons of conquest. They were tombstones. They were a monument to the dead. They were a paranoid, desperate promise made by a traumatized civilization that they would never, ever be caught off guard again. The humans didn't want to rule the galaxy. They just wanted to be left the hell alone. Vran slowly reached up to his collar. He tapped a sequence into his personal, heavily encrypted communicator. He sent a single direct, localized text transmission to the datapad resting in Admiral Thorne's pocket. Thorne pulled the pad out. He read the screen. "We understand you now." Vran did not say a word. He simply bowed his head a fraction of an inch, a gesture of absolute unyielding respect from the apex predator of the galaxy to the apex survivor. While the revelation at Jupiter shook the foundations of the Cath Empire's worldview, a very different kind of battle was raging back on the Galactic Council station of Thryme. The emergency session had been going for 12 uninterrupted hours. Grand Speaker Aurochs was still in transit back from the Sol system, leaving the floor open to the chaotic shouting of the panicked factions. The Veni delegate, unaware of what was transpiring in the shadow of Jupiter, had seized the podium. "They are a threat to the very fabric of galactic peace." The Veni screamed, its multiple limbs gesturing wildly to the assembly. 522,000 dreadnoughts. If we do not act now, if we do not cripple their economy and blockade their system, they will dictate the future of this council forever. I call for an immediate vote on Resolution 88, total economic and military quarantine of the human sector. Ambassador Vivian Sterling sat in her designated seat. She had not spoken the word in 4 hours. She was casually reviewing a data file on terraforming techniques, completely ignoring the screaming alien at the podium. The assembly began to vote. The digital tally board above the center stage flickered to life. The Veni expected a landslide. They expected the galaxy to unite in absolute terror against the human threat. They expected the Cath Empire, the long-standing military enforcers of the Council, to lead the charge. The tally board updated. Resolution 88 failed. The chamber fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The Veni delegate stared at the board, its mandibles locked in shock. What is the meaning of this? The system is malfunctioning. Run the diagnostic. The system was not malfunctioning. Down in the lower tiers, a representative from the deeply impoverished pacifist species known as the Lumar stood up. The Lumar had never won a military victory in their history. They were constantly bullied, heavily taxed, and routinely ignored by the larger empires. "We vote against sanctions," the Lumar delegate said softly. Another delegate from a minor aquatic species that had nearly been wiped out by pirates a century ago stood up. "We vote against sanctions." One by one they stood. 47 minor species. The underdogs. The forgotten. The weak. Species that had never once agreed on a single piece of legislation in the 2,000-year history of the Council. The Veni delegate pointed a trembling digit at them. Are you insane? They have 500,000 dreadnoughts. They could wipe you out in an hour. The Lumar delegate looked calmly at the Veni. Yes, they have 500,000 dreadnoughts. They have had them for 180 years. And in 180 years, they have never once demanded our territory. They have never once raised our tariffs. They have never once threatened us. The Lumar looked directly at Vivian Sterling, who had finally looked up from her datapad. A civilization with that much power that chooses not to use it against the weak is not a threat. The Lumar delegate declared, his voice ringing with newfound courage. They are the safest ally in this universe. We stand with Earth. The Veni delegate collapsed back into his seat, realizing the catastrophic political miscalculation his faction had just made. They had tried to paint humanity as a monster, and in doing so, they had accidentally forged the strongest political alliance in galactic history. But the fallout was not just political. Paranoia is a dangerous mechanism. Within 30 minutes of the failed vote, the high command of the Veni faction panicked. Convinced that Earth would retaliate against them for proposing the sanctions, the Veni issued a Priority 1 recall order. Across the galaxy, Veni armadas powered up their hyperdrives. They abandoned their forward operating bases. They retreated from 3 highly contested, resource-rich border zones they had been fighting over for decades. They pulled every single warship back to their homeworld, forming a desperate, terrified defensive perimeter around their own sun. They ran. Back in her office, Vivian Sterling watched the telemetry reports flooding in from Council's intelligence. The map of the galaxy was shifting in real time. Red icons representing Veni fleets were rapidly retreating, leaving massive voids of unclaimed peaceful space in their wake. Her assistant, Carter Brooks, stared at the monitor, his jaw slightly open. "They're giving up the disputed sectors," Carter whispered. "The trade routes are completely open. We didn't even deploy a single ship. We didn't fire a single shot." Vivian picked up her ceramic cup. Her coffee was cold, but she drank it anyway. She looked at the holographic map, at the vast, sudden peace that had fallen over a third of the galaxy, simply because the universe finally knew what humanity was capable of. "Sometimes, Carter," Vivian said softly, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, "the most destructive thing you can do to your enemies is absolutely nothing at all." The galactic extranet did not break because of a declaration of war. It broke because of a Thursday lunch menu. 3 days after the council delegation returned from the Jupiter shipyards, a video leaked. It was not a piece of classified military intelligence. It was not a threatening manifesto recorded by a human warlord. It was a simple, unauthorized documentary clip shot by an independent journalist who had managed to secure a brief interview with a human shipyard worker on Orbital Dock 7. The video spread across 100,000 star systems in a matter of hours. The alien analysts of the Cath Empire, the Veni Intelligence Network, and the Drew Republic gathered in their darkened war rooms, projecting the footage onto their massive tactical displays. They expected to see a fanatic. They expected to see a genetically modified super soldier, eyes burning with the zeal of a conqueror, boasting about the 500,000 dreadnoughts waiting in the dark. Instead, they saw Maya. She was 24 years old. She wore a heavy grease-stained industrial jumpsuit with the sleeves rolled up. Her hair was tied back in a messy knot, and she had a smudge of dark carbon scoring across her left cheek. She was floating in a zero-gravity break room, holding a pressurized pouch of water. Behind her, through the viewport, the skeletal frame of a dreadnought, the size of a city, was actively being forged in a storm of plasma welders. The unseen journalist asked her a question. The translation software carried it across the galaxy. "Does it terrify you?" the journalist asked. "To build weapons of such apocalyptic scale, to hold the power to end worlds in your hands every single day?" Maya blinked. She looked genuinely confused by the question. She looked out the window at the colossal war machine, then back to the camera. "Not really," Maya said, her voice completely casual. "I mean, mostly it's just annoying. We had a bad batch of tungsten carbide alloy come in from the asteroid miners last week, and the microfractures were throwing off my automated welding drones. I had to manually recalibrate 300 emitters. That was a nightmare." She took a sip from her water pouch, but honestly, she continued, her eyes brightening with genuine excitement. "I'm mostly just trying to get through this shift because the commissary on Deck 4 is doing the spicy beef burritos today. They only do them on Thursdays, and if you don't get there by 1300 hours, The plasma engineers eat them all. So yeah, I'm just focused on the burrito. The video ended. Across the galaxy, trillions of sentient beings stared at their screens in absolute horrifying silence. The Koth military analyst played the clip again and again. They analyzed her micro-expressions. They scanned for signs of coercion, of psychological conditioning, of chemical suppression. They found nothing. She was perfectly terrifyingly normal. That was the moment the true psychological weight of humanity finally crushed the Galactic Council. Warriors they could understand, zealots they could fight. But a species that could construct the most devastating armada in the history of the universe as a simple, mundane day job. A species that could bolt together armor plating capable of withstanding the heat of a dying star, and their primary emotional concern was missing out on a spicy lunch. It meant the Dreadnoughts were not a military project. They were an industry. They were a fundamental integrated facet of human culture. To humanity, building world-ending warships was no different than paving a road or harvesting grain. It was just Tuesday. The sheer breathtaking indifference of it paralyzed the Council. They realized that Earth did not have a military-industrial complex. Earth was a military-industrial complex. Grand Speaker Aurochs sat in his private chambers on Vthryme watching the video loop for the 10th time. His ancient stone-like face was heavy with the burden of revelation. The galaxy was standing on the edge of a knife. The Veni had retreated. The Koth were terrified. The minor factions were rallying behind Earth. The universe was holding its breath, waiting to see what the humans would do next. Aurochs knew that treaties and sanctions were entirely useless now. You cannot sanction a force of nature. You can only hope to understand its trajectory. He drafted a formal, desperate summons. It was not a demand, it was a plea. He sent it directly to Admiral Gideon Thorne. He asked for the human command structure to stand before the full assembly of the Galactic Council, not to be judged, but to explain. The galaxy needed to know the human doctrine. They needed to know what would trigger the sleeping giants above Jupiter to wake. They needed to know how to survive the humans. Admiral Gideon Thorne arrived on the station of Vthryme exactly 72 hours later. He did not bring an escort. He did not arrive in a heavily armed flagship. He arrived on a standard diplomatic courier vessel, accompanied only by Ambassador Vivian Sterling. The Great Assembly Hall was packed beyond its structural capacity. 2,000 delegates filled the tiered seats, and thousands more aides, military attaches, and journalists stood shoulder to shoulder in the aisles. The ambient noise of the crowd was a low, vibrating hum of absolute terror. Every eye was fixed on the center of the room. The massive holographic projectors above the speaker's floor had been initialized, ready to display whatever complex tactical simulations or terrifying orbital strike plans the human admiral brought with him. Thorne stepped onto the floor. He wore the same unadorned dark blue uniform he had worn at the shipyards. He walked with a slow, measured cadence. He did not look at the glowing eyes of the Koth High Marshal. He did not look at the trembling mandibles of the Veni. He walked directly to the podium and stood in the center of the light. "Turn the projectors off," Thorne said. The acoustics of the chamber carried his quiet voice perfectly. Up in the control booth, a confused technician complied. The massive holographic emitters powered down, plunging the upper reaches of the chamber into shadow. Thorne stood alone, illuminated only by a single spotlight. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The entire room tensed. Security drones twitched their targeting lasers, painting the floor millimeters from Thorne's boots. Thorne did not pull out a weapon. He did not pull out a data drive or a holographic emitter or a neural link interface. He pulled out a piece of paper. It was a physical, archaic wood pulp document. It had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases were frayed and soft. It was yellowed with age. The aliens stared at it. Many of the younger species had never seen actual paper before. It was a relic, a dead technology. "You asked for our doctrine," Thorne began, his voice echoing in the vast silence. "You asked for our rules of engagement. You want to know what algorithms govern the deployment of the Jupiter fleet. You want to know what mathematical equations we use to decide who lives and who dies." He looked up, scanning the infinite rows of alien faces. "You are looking in the wrong place. Our doctrine was not written by generals. It was not calculated by artificial intelligence. It was not debated in a room like this." Thorne gently placed the folded piece of paper on the podium. He smoothed it out with the palm of his hand. Our doctrine was written by a man named Silas Croft. A murmur of confusion rippled through the hall. Translation matrices worked frantically, searching galactic databases for the name of this legendary human warlord. They found nothing. Silas Croft was not a soldier. Thorne continued. He was a miner. He was born in a place called Oregon, on the western coast of the North American continent on Earth. It is a place of cold oceans and deep forests. Silas loved the rain. He loved the smell of the pine trees. He had a wife and he had 3 daughters. The aliens listened completely bewildered. They had braced themselves for a declaration of galactic dominance. Instead, they were being told a story about a peasant. When the Silent War began, Thorne said the temperature in the room seemingly dropping 10 degrees at the mention of the conflict. Silas Croft was too old to fight in the infantry, but he knew how to weld high-density alloys. So he packed a single bag, kissed his wife and daughters goodbye, and took a shuttle to the Jupiter shipyards. Thorne gripped the edges of the podium. His knuckles turned white. For 40 years, Silas Croft lived in a pressurized metal box. He woke up in the artificial dark. He put on a heavy irradiated environmental suit. He stepped out into the freezing vacuum of space, tethered to the skeleton of a dreadnought, and he welded armor plates. Thorne's voice began to build in intensity, the rhythmic cadence of a eulogy. He did not build one ship. He did not build 10. Over the course of 4 decades, Silas Croft personally laid the structural foundation for 314 Dreadnought-class vessels. He shattered the cartilage in his knees. He burned his retinas. He breathed in metallic dust until his lungs bled. Thorne looked directly at the Cath High Marshal. He never fired a weapon in his entire life. He never saw an alien world. He never stood on a bridge and commanded a fleet. He just worked. In the dark. In the cold. Until his body simply gave out. Why a voice called out from the darkness of the upper tiers? It was the Lumar delegate. Why would a sentient being subject themselves to that? Thorne looked down at the frayed piece of paper. Because of this, Thorne whispered. He picked the paper up. He held it so the entire galaxy could see the faded handwritten ink. Silas Croft's parents lived in the Sirius B colony. Thorne said, his voice cracking, just a fraction, betraying the immense crushing weight of human sorrow. They were there on the first day of the Silent War, when the sky shattered, when the machines arrived. Thorne looked back out at the assembly. Silas Croft did not build those ships out of a desire to conquer you. He did not build them out of a lust for power. He built them because he remembered the silence that followed the machines. He built them because he was absolutely, unconditionally terrified that his 3 daughters would one day look up at the sky and see the darkness falling again. Thorne took a deep breath. The silence in the great assembly hall was absolute. 2,000 alien delegates were completely paralyzed by the raw, bleeding gravity of human trauma. Our doctrine is not a threat, Thorne declared, his voice ringing like a bell forged from iron. It is a promise. It is an oath written in the blood of 23 million people who burned in a single afternoon. We built the fleet to make sure that the universe would never ever be allowed to be that quiet again. Thorne looked down at the paper. We do not want your worlds. We do not want your resources. We do not want your trade routes or your political leverage. He began to read from the paper. Elias Croft, Martha Croft, Sarah Jenkins, David Hayes, Marcus Vance, Chloe Sterling. He read name after name. They were not soldiers. They were not politicians. They were the names of children, the names of teachers, the names of farmers. He read for 4 uninterrupted minutes. No one moved. No one spoke. The arrogant elder gods of the galaxy sat in their gilded chairs and listened to a human admiral read a list of ghosts. When Thorne finally reached the bottom of the page, he stopped. He carefully, reverently folded the paper back into its original square. He placed it back inside his jacket over his heart. We are not monsters hiding in the dark, Thorne said softly. We are the ones who hunt the monsters. He looked up at Grand Speaker Orox. We will not disarm. We will not submit to your oversight. The fleet will remain at Jupiter. It will remain dark. It will remain silent. And as long as you do not bring the fire to our shores, you will never see them again. But if a threat ever rises from the deep black, if the machines ever return, if a shadow ever falls across the innocent worlds of this council, Thorne's eyes swept the room one last time. You will not need to ask for our help. You will simply look up and the sky will be filled with iron. Admiral Gideon Thorne turned around and walked off the speaker's floor. The silence that followed his departure was not the silence of fear. It was not the panicked, erratic silence of prey realizing a predator was in the room. It was a heavy, profound silence. It was the silence of a paradigm shifting. It was the sound of a galaxy completely rewriting its understanding of the universe. High Marshal Vran remained in his seat. The supreme warlord of the Cath Empire, a species that worshipped strength above all else, felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation in his chest. It was not terror, it was awe. He realized that true strength was not the ability to destroy a world. True strength was having the power to destroy 1,000 worlds, and choosing instead to sit in the cold vacuum of space for 180 years, simply to stand guard. Grand Speaker Aurochs stood up behind his podium. He leaned heavily on his ceremonial staff. He looked out at the assembly. He saw the Vanni delegate pale and shivering, not with fear of humanity, but with the sudden, crushing realization of their own insignificance. He saw the Lumar delegate weeping softly. For 300 years, Aurochs said, his ancient voice echoing in the stillness, this council has maintained a specific classification, a title reserved only for a civilization that demonstrates a power absolute paired with a restraint divine. A species that acts not as a ruler, but as a shield. Aurochs raised his gavel. There has not been a guardian signatory recognized in 3 centuries, because no species has been worthy of the burden. He looked toward the empty speaker's floor where Thorne had stood. I call for an immediate unanimous motion to bypass all standard parliamentary procedures. I call for the recognition of Earth and the human species as the sole active guardian signatory of the Galactic Council. The voting did not take long. There was no debate. There was no political maneuvering. The digital tally board flared to life above the center stage. It was a wall of solid, unbroken green light. It was unanimous. Even the Vanni, terrified of the dark, voted yes, because they suddenly understood that the humans were the only thing standing between them and the true horrors of the abyss. Earth had not conquered the galaxy with weapons. They had conquered it with their morality. Far from the deafening noise of the great assembly hall in a quiet, dimly lit observation corridor, looking out over the spinning void of space, Admiral Gideon Thorne stood alone. He was tired. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind the deep, aching exhaustion that had settled into his bones over decades of command. He unbuttoned the collar of his uniform and leaned his forehead against the cool, reinforced glass of the viewport. Outside, the stars of the Vithryme sector burned bright and clear. It was a beautiful galaxy, chaotic, arrogant, flawed, but beautiful. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted personal communicator. It was a direct, localized, quantum-entangled line back to a specific relay on Earth. He pressed the activation rune. The connection established instantly, cutting through thousands of light years of dead space. A voice answered. It was static-laced, but warm. It was the middle of the night back in Washington, D.C. Hello? His sister's voice echoed through the small speaker. Hey, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a soft, exhausted rasp. Did I wake you always, Gideon? You always wake me. There was a smile in her voice, the soft rustle of sheets. Where are you? Are you on your way home soon? Thorne said. He looked out at the stars. He thought about Silas Croft. He thought about the 314 ships built by one man's bleeding hands. He thought about the vast sleeping wall of iron floating in the dark above Jupiter. How did it go? She asked. The big meeting. Are the aliens going to sanction us? Are they going to try and take the fleet? Thorne closed his eyes. He felt the piece of paper resting in his breast pocket, pressing against his heart. No, he said softly. No one is taking the fleet. What did you do? She asked, a hint of genuine curiosity breaking through her sleepiness. Did you threaten them? Did you have to show them the targeting algorithms? I didn't do anything, Thorne replied. I just told them the truth. I told them about us. He opened his eyes. The galaxy stretched out before him, a tapestry of light and shadow. But it didn't look terrifying anymore. It didn't look like a hunting ground. I told them that the silence is over, Thorne whispered to the stars. He smiled. A real, genuine smile. The first one he had worn in a very long time. Go back to sleep, Thorne said to his sister. Tell the kids I'll be home for the weekend. The sky is clear. He terminated the connection. He stood there for a few minutes longer, letting the quiet of the station wash over him. The universe was vast and it was full of monsters. But humanity had built a wall, and the wall would hold. Admiral Gideon Thorne turned away from the glass, straightened his uniform, and began the long walk back to his ship. The job was done. It was time to go home.